Thanks everyone for joining us at the Project Censored radio show on Pacifica Radio. I am your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, and we're very glad right now to once again be joined by Leonardo Flores, who's the co-founder of the Venezuela Solidarity Network. He previously worked as an organizer with CODEPINK and as an analyst with the Venezuelan Embassy in the US. Leonardo was born in Venezuela and maintains close ties to social movements that have transformed the country over the past 26 years. Leo, thanks so much for joining us again.
Of course, it's always a pleasure to be on with you, Eleanor.
It's always a pleasure to see you. Even in or particularly in these times. And of course, folks may have heard or probably have heard about the devastating double earthquake that hit Venezuela on June 24th, a 7.2 and a 7.5, only 39 seconds apart. There were more than 700 aftershocks. And as of now, more than 3,300 people have been declared dead, more than 16,000 injured, and more than 40,000 are still missing. So folks may have heard about that, but of course, what you're not going to hear on corporate media is what I want to start with asking you, Leo, because of course, any country's disaster response is very much tied to how much money that disaster response has to maintain some basic infrastructure and things like that. So, just starting off here, Leo, could you talk to us about how U.S. sanctions and the current political situation, just with the president and the first lady being in prison in Brooklyn, how has that hampered Venezuela's disaster response after these earthquakes?
Well, I'll start with kind of the smallest impact and go on to the biggest. But so for example, the day of the earthquake, the night I was on the phone with a comrade who works at Code Pink, and we were talking about we have to set up a fundraiser right away. And then it took us about a week to set it up because of U.S. sanctions were making it impossible to send money to organizations in Venezuela. And that's nothing new. That's something that's been happening over the past, 11, 13 years. And so, immediately there's this kind of bottleneck because in those immediate, first 72 hours, it's totally in the news and people want to help and people want to give money. And there was no way to really do it. And then you had a lot of like fake news and disinformation on social media saying, oh, don't even give money to the Venezuelan Red Cross. It's controlled by the government. It isn't. But like that even shouldn't be a point because the point was to help people and to help people survive this horrible event. And so U.S. sanctions were impeding that. And now Code Pink does have a fundraiser, which I will share. It's codepink.org/emergency fund. I encourage people to give. That's going to go directly to grassroots and to communes in Venezuela who are helping firsthand with the victims. And then, more broadly, when we look at these 12 years or so of economic warfare from the United States, it had a massive impact. And I've talked about it on the show before, but it's really worth repeating the impact of U.S. economic warfare in Venezuela. So these sanctions, the so-called, which are really so-called sanctions, because technically they're known as unilateral coercive measures, because the only body that can actually sanction according to international law is the United Nations, and there are no UN sanctions on Venezuela. These are mostly from the United States, from other NATO countries. And they've cost an estimated $630 billion worth of damages to the Venezuelan economy. There was a study by the Center for Economic and Policy Research that found that the Trump administration's sanctions in 2017, 2018 caused 40,000 excess deaths in that year alone. And so we can say with a lot of confidence that sanctions have been causing roughly 10,000 plus deaths a year in Venezuela since 2017. And on top of that, one of the things that it goes underreported is the effect of sanctions on migration, right? And so there's been a mass exodus of millions of people from Venezuela. Some are now coming back. But what that does is so there was a study by the UN has a special rapporteur on the negative effects of unilateral coercive measures. Her name is Alina Duhan. And in 2021, she did this report where she found that the public service sector had lost anywhere between 30 to 50% of its employees because of the impact of the sanctions. Some of those migrated, some of those left for other jobs. But immediately, when you have such kind of a wild and a drastic decrease in the number of public sector employees, that's going to have long-term effects, right? And so you have fewer doctors, fewer engineers, fewer nurses, fewer teachers, fewer, emergency response workers, and that is going to have an impact. And finally, I would say that another impact of these sanctions is that it really makes it more difficult for Venezuela to buy heavy machinery. to take care of things like infrastructure, to build more roads, and to upgrade airports, to build housing. And so all of that combined makes it so that the response to the earthquake in Venezuela was made much more difficult because of U.S. sanctions.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I want to kind of shift gears here because if you know, listeners might also be familiar with what's known as the shock doctrine. This concept, also the title of a 2007 book by Naomi Klein, and it's the US or really any imperial core country, is the habit of taking advantage of disasters, either natural or manufactured, to swoop in and take control economically, politically, militarily, or some combination thereof, not just in places like Venezuela. I mean, we saw this happen after Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana. So in foreign areas and at home as well. But um, there's this like basically what the US could do to really help is just lift the sanctions, right? But that's not going to work for the US political interests. So on July 2nd, the US South Command Commander General Francis Donovan announced the deployment of some 2,000 military personnel in response to Venezuela's earthquakes. And yet, acting president, former Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, then thanked US President Donald Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio for their permanent contact and support. She went on to acknowledge the US major logistical deployment to receive humanitarian aid. Now, of course, I can recognize nuance in a situation, and I'd like to get your take on this because two things can be true at once. It is possible that the US is using its military to deliver aid, but one would be remarkably naive in thinking that that's the full story. So, could you fill us on what's happening with Southcom's opportunistic shock doctrining here and, Delcy's response and things like that?
Yeah, and it's really interesting because there has been a lot of kind of analysis of, especially comparing the response to the earthquake in Venezuela with what happened to the earthquake in Haiti, when immediately after the earthquake in Haiti, 20,000 U.S. troops were deployed to Haiti, and that really just set the stage for decades of more colonialism for Haiti, unfortunately. But in this case, Southern Command says 2,000 troops, but 1,200 of those aren't even in the country. They're in Puerto Rico, they're in Trinidad and Tobago, and other bases and on ships. I think something like 900 troops from the United States, and that includes like engineers and rescue workers and all that, are actually on the ground in Venezuela. But Southcom had this really interesting, they sent this press release on that day, and they said, as directed by the Department of War, U.S. Southern Command is currently working with the Department of State to support U.S. government relief operations in Venezuela in response to yesterday's devastating earthquakes. Our joint forces are moving quickly to bring the unmatched airlift, logistics, and life-saving capabilities of the U.S. military to save lives and support the government of Venezuela during this crisis. Do you know how many people these U.S. Southern Command forces have saved in Venezuela? Five. Five. That's out of 6,462 people that have been rescued overall. Only five have been rescued by the U.S. troops. So clearly, the United States here is, first of all, it's kind of trying to whitewash its image in Venezuela because obviously a huge percentage of the population doesn't like the United States because of, not only because of what it did on January 3rd with the bombing of Caracas, the kidnapping of the president and first lady, but also what I mentioned before, the decades of economic war, the hybrid war. So there's a lot of animosity towards the United States government that now the U.S. government is trying to whitewash its image. But that said, I think the government of Delcy Rodriguez is kind of in an impossible position where they can't say no to aid from any sector because the tragedy is immense. There's you mentioned the number of killed. So far, it's at 3,500. There are at least 100. There are at least 190 buildings that have totally collapsed, and other nearly 1,000 buildings that have suffered either light to major damage. So it's a tragedy of a very kind of immense scale, and Venezuela needs all the help that it can get. And just politically, I think the government of Delcy Rodriguez is in a situation where it can't say no to any sort of help. There's even actually, an Israeli contingent of about, I think it was roughly 30 people, mostly technicians who are coming to Venezuela to review buildings to see if they're safe or not, because you mentioned it was a double earthquake, and that's something that's really rare. And so I was looking back because I remembered that there was an earthquake in Venezuela in 2018, and it was 7.3, which is a pretty big. And really, the consequences were minimal. I think something like 6 people died, and those people died from like accidents and heart attacks, not from only building collapses. So Venezuela is kind of in this kind of unique position right now where, you know, because it was such a massive earthquake that affected so many buildings that you need to bring on help from wherever you can to not only to help rescue the people who might still be alive. I think we're closing in on nearly 2 weeks since the earthquake happened, so now the hopes of rescuing more people grow fainter every day. But there's still a massive need to ensure that you can identify which buildings are safe to go into to go back into, because there's a lot of people who have lost their homes, who are living in in encampments and refugee shelters, who have gone to other states of the country to live with family members, and they want to go back to their homes. They want to rebuild their lives, and you can't do that unless you can certify that the buildings that remain are still safe. And so, what the United States is doing is the thing is, I mean, I'm kind of hesitating because within the Trump administration itself, there's kind of two lines on Venezuela. There's kind of the economic line, where you have this kind of sector of the White House that really just wants the oil and really just wants to open the doors for U.S. corporations to step in before the sanctions are lifted, if they're going to be lifted, so that the U.S. can stick its foot in the door and all these U.S. corporations can go into the country and kind of push out their Chinese, Russian, other international counterparts. And then there's another wing within the White House, typically identified with Marco Rubio, that wants full regime change in Venezuela. And so right now, the Marco Rubio wing, they had a major victory with the attack on Venezuela, but they are kind of being pushed aside a little bit because what the Trump administration wants is stability. And so, and I say this because it's really interesting, is that the Venezuelan fascist opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, who had won the Nobel Peace Prize despite calling for her country to be bombed, she's been desperate to go back to Venezuela to capitalize on the tragedy and to turning it into a political victory for herself. But the Trump administration is basically saying, no, you can't go back. And that's because that's one of the red lines of the Rodriguez government at this point, is that they don't want her back, because if she comes back, she would be under arrest, and that would cause immediate friction with the United States. So the U.S. is now really trying to push its way in through these kind of military logistics into Venezuela, and they're not going to be successful to the extent that they want, because first of all, nobody wants the U.S. in Venezuela, and because the government is still strong, and it's strong in the sense that the communes still back the government, the organized people still back the government. There's a very clear connection between people's power and the state. There's a civil military alliance, and all of that. That means that basically Chavismo, which is the movement behind the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, is strong despite all of these setbacks that it has suffered. And so the U.S. wants to break that, of course, but they also want continued access to the oil. And so this tension isn't resolving itself yet for the United States, but they're trying to make inroads. So, I mean, and it's also, I kind of poke fun of the fact that the United States only saved 5 people, but it's still important that they're there because they are playing an important role, right? And I do want to talk a little bit about some of the misinformation we've seen, because at one point, the corporate media and the Venezuelan opposition was saying that the Venezuelan government wasn't allowing the international aid, and it all stemmed from this video where you have the Minister of the Interior, Diosdado Cabello, who's a very kind of high-ranking person within the revolution, telling the United States there were U.S. troops nearby, kind of pushing with trucks and making a lot of noise. He basically ordered all of those trucks to turn off because there was a rescue operation underway with dogs that they send teams with dogs to these kind of collapsed buildings to listen for people, and they couldn't listen if there was too much noise. And so he ordered them to shut down, and then that small little snip of a video was then made viral, and it was, the Venezuelan government was being accused of shutting down international aid, which wasn't the case at all, of course.
I mean, yeah, it sounds, and to your point, like the US being there, you could, it's kind of like USAID. It's like there were some good things that USAID did. They were also a CIA operation, but it reminds me of Scott Crow, who wrote actually a book about this, but how he was supporting legitimate mutual aid down in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, and then the Red Cross, when it finally did show up, brought a truck full of plastic utensils. And Scott was like, what am I supposed to do? People don't have anything to eat this with, but thanks for the forks. I mean, that
And
feels very
before you
much.
go to your next question, because could I add something real quick that I meant to add? Because you mentioned the shock doctrine. And I think it's really important to see what's going to happen in Venezuela with the reconstruction within the next 6 months to a year, because something similar happened to the same state of Venezuela that we're talking about. We're talking about the state of La Guaira, which is just north of Caracas. Caracas is in a valley. To the north, there's mountains, and then it's the coast. And that coastal area is the state that's most affected. And in 1999, there were massive mudslides that killed tens of thousands of people in that very same state, and then a massive reconstruction effort. And one of the curious things that happened was that in any, very particularly capitalist country with a capitalist fascist government, the reconstruction would have been basically hotels and casinos because this was prime coastal area with very nice beaches. But the revolutionary government in Venezuela, what they did was build social housing throughout that area. And so we had kind of a reverse shock doctrine where instead of people not just losing their homes to the tragedy, would be pushed out and gentrified and displaced, they instead had more people's power because they actually had better housing than they had before. So we'll see what happens in Venezuela. I think that's going to be a very important sign to keep track of in terms of really who's in charge of Venezuela and what the values of the Venezuelan government are.
Well, and I want to, before I move on, since you brought that up, I want to ask you because it seems like now there's more pressure on the Venezuelan government than there has ever before. So, what do you expect, or what would you think that Delcy Rodriguez and the government would need to or acquiesce to, or something like that, like, oh no, you need this many hotels, or we're not going to lift sanctions or something like that. Like, what do you think that they might actually have to capitulate on in reconstruction because the pressure is so much greater than it was in, say, 99?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not clear right now, there is quite a lot of pressure on the Venezuelan government to change its kind of internal laws, and we've seen that happen to greater and lesser extents, particularly with laws relating to oil and to minerals. It's not clear at all, though, that that pressure is going to expand into what can and can't be built. I think the Venezuelan government has already kind of acquiesced to certain demands, especially regarding aid. So the main form that the Venezuelan government is asking for aid is through this thing called the CAF, which is the Andean Community Fund. It's basically a group of nations in the Andes that have a development bank. And now the funds that the Venezuelan government is asking for are being set through this development bank, and they're going to be in there. Specifically, that money is going to be used to build housing, right? And hopefully it'll be social housing, but we'll see what happens. But and not only that, but these funds are going to be there's going to be accounting firms doing a lot of what's called when they review your accounts. I'm blanking on the word, but basically
Audit.
the audits. Exactly. There's international accounting firms that are going to be doing audits of everything that happens here. So already that's kind of like a small infringement on sovereignty with since these audits are being really asked for by the United States. But I mean, I personally find it hard to care about that. I just want people to have their houses again, for these buildings to go back up. But we'll see what happens in terms of how much social housing is built, how much isn't. And then there's also a really curious fact, because immediately after the earthquake, there was this really, I think it was a front page article in the Washington Post where they really hit hard at Venezuela's Great Housing Mission, and that's a social program that's built homes for 5.2 million homes in the past 10 or so years. And the Washington Post claim was that these collapsed immediately and that everyone died and that it's a horrible disaster and it's a stain on the legacy of Chavismo. But then when you look at the facts, you see that out of the 190 or so buildings that are totally collapsed, and that number is growing as more buildings are going to be, primed for total destruction because they can't stand. But out of those 190 buildings, I think the figure so far is 10. 10 of those have been social housing missions, and less than 10% overall. So that would be roughly about 5%, but less than 10% overall have been public buildings. So the vast majority of the destroyed buildings have been private sector. And yet the Venezuelan government is being really hit hard, particularly by the international media, on this issue of, oh, the social housing that you brag so much about is in total shambles. And the fact is that that's not the case. In fact, social housing, none of the social housing mission buildings collapsed in Caracas itself. where there are about 8 or 10 other private buildings that did collapse.
It's almost like when there's a profit incentive, you don't build the best housing. Um, Yeah, no, I mean it's so classic. Like the Washington Post and the New York Times, they'll often do this with China too. Like China created, built this many homes for this many people and dragged, billion people out of poverty, but at what cost? And you're
Yeah.
like, what? How are you trying to make this sound bad? Um, and I want to circle back to something that you mentioned because it once again shows the intersections of issues and that none of us exist in an issue silo. But we've had you on the show before and you've talked about how Venezuela has been very firm and very clear on its pro-Palestine stance. But as you mentioned just a few days ago, also under the headline of humanitarian aid, an Israeli delegation came to Caracas. And I mean, the irony is just dead here. The IDF claimed that its humanitarian delegation would support recovery efforts and share Israel's experience in emergency situations. And I'm not sure, I mean, if the emergency situation means the IOF will be on hand to shoot Venezuelan kids in the head or what specifically that means. I mean, you literally have the two nations that are built and sustained on genocidal violence and destruction. These are the two nations that are coming to aid Venezuela right now. It just hurts my brain. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this. I mean, what does this mean for Venezuela's stance on occupied Palestine with the IOF just shoving its way in a bit like the US?
Yeah, I hope it doesn't mean anything for it. I know that comrades in Venezuela are very upset about the presence of Israeli technical advisors in Venezuela, and lots of people are upset about it. But again, it was a kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. First of all, the advisors, Israel was basically asked to send aid from the Jewish community in Caracas. And so, if somehow the president had said no, then immediately, not only would you get all these accusations of, oh, they're anti Semitic in Venezuela because they're saying no to the Jewish community, which has happened in the past. It's a great cost to Venezuela internationally. Um, but then, again, there's so many affected buildings that, like, I understand the need for it. And to me, it's totally disgusting that you have Israel whitewashing all of its crime was with this kind of pittance of aid that they're sending to Venezuela. The United States doing the same. I mean, the number one whitewasher really has been President Nayib Bukele of El Salvador, who was just constantly on social media within, in the first 3-4 days of the disaster, saying how much good the rescuers from El Salvador were doing in Venezuela, and that part was true, right? But it's not really an excuse. It doesn't. It's not something that somehow makes all of your crimes go away because you're helping in a different situation. I'm not sure that this is going to mean, a resumption of diplomatic ties between the two countries. And, Venezuela broke off ties with Israel. I want to say it was in 2009 over bombings in Gaza. And it hasn't, President Maduro was one of the first to call it a genocide, was one of the first to draw a direct comparison between the Israeli government and the IOF and Nazism. And so, Venezuela would be in a very strange position if it had to accept resuming times with Israel. I hope it's not going to happen. We'll see. But certainly within the grassroots, there is total support for Palestine, and not just within the grassroots. Within the upper members of the government and the revolution as well, they totally support Palestine. But the reality is that the scale and scope of the magnitude of the destruction here has put them in a position where they can't say no to any aid, particularly because the corporate media has been so vicious in going after Venezuela for any perceived slight. Right? President Delcy Rodriguez had this news conference late last week, and every question was just like really offensive. Where they were saying, where you had journalists saying, "Well, everyone I talk to hates the government." Like, what really is that? Because you sought out people who were in the opposition, or is that because you actually talked to a lot of people? Because I've seen video after video of people being rescued and thanking the rescuers who were clearly part of Venezuelan security services or Venezuelan rescue services. And so, within this context of this kind of media war against Venezuela, the government has to walk this very kind of fine line between what it can and what it can't do. Certainly, it can accept aid from any place that offers it. I don't think they're in a position to say no to aid. Hopefully, that it's not going to translate into greater loss of sovereignty in the sense of resumption of ties with Israel in any way. But I would just add that kind of historically, Venezuela, there's some really interesting parallels with history because back in the early 1800s, there was another massive earthquake that hit Venezuela right in the middle of its kind of Revolutionary War of Independence, and that was, there was a fear that that earthquake would really just tamp down any desire to for freedom from Spain, but it didn't. It actually furthered it. And then back in 1999, which is the first year of Chavez's first year in office, you had the same tragedy in La Guaira, the landslides, and again that there was a fear that, oh, this is just going to destroy the movement because it's so bad and everyone's just going to blame the government. But it didn't. Actually, the revolutionary forces got stronger, and the revolution itself deepened. And so I think there is also an opportunity for that to happen, because in this the immediate response. I think the government says that they sent within the first 24 hours 4,000 troops, then 11,000, then 19,000 to help with the recovery efforts. But more importantly, there were something like 28,000 volunteers who were organized, who were helping people not just in shelters and not with food, but also digging people out. And so that kind of grassroots organization, coordinated in part with the government, was key in this the rescue of these 6,400 people that I mentioned, right? Because it wasn't just professional rescue workers doing all of that. It was organized communities. And so there is a possibility, I think, that the revolution is going to come out stronger because the need for grassroots organizing becomes much more obvious during this sort of disaster, right? Because it takes time for police and rescue services to respond if a building collapses. But if it's 180 buildings that all collapse and hundreds more that are partially destroyed, then yeah, it's going to take time and maybe even days before anyone official gets to you, right? But your neighbors can help you, and your neighbors are going to be the first responders. And seeing that is going to help build not just community, but it builds people's power. So I think Venezuela is at a really interesting crossroads. Where clearly the United States and Venezuela's enemies, including its domestic enemies and Venezuela's fascists, are doing everything they can to not just discredit the government response, but to discredit the 20 years of social victories in Venezuela. And on the other hand, you have organized communities who support the government, who are getting even more organized. And so that's going to come to a head at some point. We'll see what happens. It's clearly, I don't want to speculate too much on what may or may not happen, but I think those are two very kind of clear paths that might occur.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I'm also curious because you mentioned El Salvador, and of course recently Colombia has fallen to U.S. interventionism. And I'm curious about regional support and, whether that's from the likes of Scheinbaum in Mexico. Cuba just recently acquiesced to foreign investment, and then the US hit it with more sanctions because the US is absolutely insane. So there's a lot happening in the region, both in terms of natural disasters like the earthquakes, but also the the politicking of the US that is really going into overdrive. We've talked about on the show, you and I, about the murder of fishermen and people in boats on the Pacific side predominantly. But I'm curious if there's been regional support, and if you then, because you were just talking about how this can ramp up this revolutionary solidarity. I wonder if you're seeing that in terms of regional support, particularly as we see more and more places falling, either the government falling, like in Colombia, or previous stances, like in Cuba, falling, like with foreign investment. Do you see that this being a bit of a catalyst regionally for that kind of solidarity?
Well, it better be, because really that sort of solidarity and unity is the only thing that's going to let Latin America and the Caribbean withstand U.S. empire. Because U.S. empire has really shifted, particularly during the Trump administration, but even before, right? In terms of specifically looking at Latin America and the Caribbean, where before it was all about kind of loans and trade and financial pressure. and then kind of light, attempts at electoral interference through by basically funding opposition parties. It slowly became shifted to, and that was to what it had been before, which was outright coups, which is outright U.S. intervention in elections, which we saw in Colombia very clearly. If not a total theft and fraud of those elections stolen by the Colombian right. And then, of course, the attack on Venezuela, the naval blockades, the extrajudicial bombings and killings of fishermen throughout the Caribbean and the Pacific. And without kind of a unified Latin America, and it hasn't been unified enough to prevent any of these things, but the only way forward is through unity. And that's a lesson that's been kind of learned and then lost and then relearned again in Latin America over the last 200 years. But right now, I think most of the solidarity comes from movements more than governments, because the governments in the progressive governments and the left governments in Latin America are under massive amounts of pressure, right? And so it's not just Cuba and Venezuela; those are obviously the two most kind of prime examples of U.S. pressure in the region. But even the government of Mexico is under tremendous pressure from the United States, where there's constantly threats of even bombings. Right? They've threatened to bomb Mexico. They've threatened to intervene more and more in the country, and we've seen it. Just a couple of months ago, you had a couple of CIA agents who died in a drug trafficking operation in Mexico, and it turned out that the federal government in Mexico knew nothing about their presence there. So they were operating with local police, cooperating with them, and not telling the federal government. And so, because of all that pressure, it's been hard for, say, someone like Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, to send oil to Cuba, for example, or to take a really strong stance against the attack on Venezuela. I mean, obviously they took a strong stance against it, but had it been a different era, and I'm talking even just 20 years ago when Hugo Chavez was alive, had something like that happened, you would have had a much more comprehensive response from regional governments, like withdrawing their ambassadors or maybe ending diplomatic relations, something concrete rather than mere words. Unfortunately, right now, these governments are all divided, and I don't mean divided internally. I mean there's not enough unity between the progressive governments, whether it's Brazil and Mexico and Nicaragua, particularly Brazil and Mexico, and formerly Colombia. I mean, Colombia still there hasn't been the inauguration yet, but those three governments in particular haven't really done enough to unify the continent. And actually the attempts to unify the continent that were led primarily by Cuba and by Venezuela in the early 2000s led to the creation of multilateral organizations like the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Nations. Those institutions were just kind of eroded very slowly by U.S. pressure. And so the U.S. has been playing this really kind of well, in the sense of, like, from an imperialist perspective, they've done this job of dividing Latin America and making solidarity very costly. But that said, there's a ton of solidarity and connections within social movements. And I think that is going to, in the long run, it's going to help Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole. And then that's going to lead to greater unity. Whether that can translate into political power and into alliances between different countries to finally withstand and stand up to U.S. imperialism in the region, I mean, I think that's yet to be determined.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope. I'm not optimistic, but I hope. And I mean, we're basically out of time, but I wanted to make sure to ask this before we wrap up, because it's something that it doesn't even get covered anymore. The fact that, again, Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores are still in prison in New York. And I was wondering if you could give folks an update about that.
Yeah, so their next hearing is July 22nd. There's going to be protests and rallies outside of the Brooklyn Detention Center. I think it's called the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, where they're being held. I think one of the organizers of that is the Bronx Anti-War Committee. If you can, look them up on the internet, you'll be able to plug in, especially if you're in the New York area for that day. But it's really sad to the extent to, like, how their imprisonment has just been kind of forgotten by many in the United States, especially. We're talking about two people who were elected, because the first lady was not just the first lady; she was also a member of the National Assembly, elected to her office. And they were both kidnapped, and they're both being held in solitary detention. Um, and it's a horrible situation. And as we've talked about before, the most serious charges against them were dropped immediately as soon as they were in custody. And I think the U.S. is really scrambling to really build a strong case against them, and that's why we see all these motions to postpone. I mean, their last hearing actually was supposed to be June 30th, but it got postponed, and not for any other reason that the prosecution needed more time, right? And so clearly their right to a speedy trial is being infringed upon. They shouldn't even be on trial at all, because according to international law, executives and parliamentarians have immunity, especially in the United States, where they've committed no crimes. So at the Venezuela Solidarity Network, that's something we talk about every time at our monthly webinars. We're bringing up support for President Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely just grotesque that they are being tried for anything, but then that you can imprison somebody and then just be like, hold on, let me figure out why we imprisoned them. Let me come up with something. I mean, it's so absurd. And meanwhile, anytime like Mexico asks for people to be extradited to Mexico, the US is like, what? Nope. Never does it. So, yeah, the double standard is pretty glaring. So, folks, do check out the Venezuela Solidarity Network. Leo does great work of trying to bridge the gap, the large and increasing gap of information that you'll never get from corporate media. So, Leo, thank you so much for coming on the show again, and appreciate all your work.
Thanks so much for the invite. And then one last time, please donate codepink.org/emergency fund. That's going to go directly to grassroots groups to help them rebuild from this earthquake.
Awesome. Thanks. We'll put that in the show notes as well.
Great.
Thanks, Leo.
Yeah, anytime.